Hank received shocking evidence of Louise's betrayal, a document signed by her business partner, but her signature had been forged. His heart shattered with pain, but instead of destroying her, he decides to play it smart. Revenge won't be simple. He wants her to realize her mistakes on her own. But will he be able to forgive her when the truth comes to light? All of Louise's secrets, betrayal, manipulations, it will all be revealed. And this is not the end. Hank sat in the kitchen, watching the clock tick with its relentless rhythm. It was Friday, and Louise was supposed to come home late, as she had started working at a prestigious restaurant. He had never paid much attention to her work schedule, as Louise was always energetic and successful at her job. But lately, she had become distant. She would disappear for hours without warning, and even when she was home, her gaze often seemed absent. Hank wasn't paranoid. He wasn't the type of man to make up stories, but something in her behavior began to unsettle him. Last night, she stayed late at work and didn't answer his calls. When she returned, he saw something strange in her eyes, as if she was lost in her own thoughts that didn't include him. Maybe I'm just tired, he thought, running his hands through his hair. But something inside him wouldn't let him rest. With a swift movement, he grabbed his phone and checked her recent messages. No responses to his questions, just short and distant phrases like, "I'm at work, we'll talk later," or "meeting with a client." From the words, he couldn't tell where she was or who she was with. This wasn't her usual style. She always gave more details, even when hanging out with friends. Hank sighed and pressed a button on the phone. He wasn't the kind of man who snooped on others, but his intuition told him something wasn't right. He decided to look at her phone, but just as he was about to, Louise returned home. She walked into the kitchen, smiled at him, and said, "Hi, darling. How was your day?" Her voice was soft, but there was something in her tone that didn't sit well with Hank. "It's fine, but something's off with you," he said, not hiding his concern. "You've changed. Is this about your work? I've noticed you're spending more time at work and acting distant." Louise paused, then laughed, as if it was all a silly misunderstanding. "Hank, you're overthinking things. I'm just very busy right now. That's all. Nothing serious," she said, sitting down at the table and began looking at her phone. Hank wasn't sure if he should press further. He had to let it go for now, but his thoughts wouldn't stop churning with that nagging feeling. That evening, Louise went out to meet friends. She didn't say where exactly, only promised to be back within 2 hours. Hank stayed home, but he felt like something important was hanging in the air. Over the next few days, Hank noticed more strange behavior from Louise, more unexplained absences, brief replies to calls, and a lingering scent of perfume that, to him, didn't seem like her usual fragrance. All these little things started to form a picture he didn't want to see. Finally, one evening, he got his chance to find out more. Louise came home irritated, immediately went to the bathroom, but left her phone on the kitchen table. This was his chance. Hank took a deep breath and approached the phone. His heart raced, but he tried to stay composed. He felt that now, he might finally uncover the truth. Looking at the screen, he saw the last few messages, several from a man named Thomas. "When can we meet again?" he read. But that wasn't all. Hank opened the chat and found other messages. "You're amazing," and "that was unforgettable." His hands began to shake, and a chill ran down his spine. Soon after, Louise came out of the bathroom, saw Hank holding her phone, and shrugged. "What are you doing, Hank?" she asked, trying to hide the nervousness in her voice. Hank remained silent, just staring at her expression. He already knew the answer but needed to hear it from her. "I understand, Louise," he said coldly, looking her in the eyes. "You've been cheating on me." Louise gasped, her eyes flashed, and a smile appeared on her lips that resembled more of a grimace. "You know everything?" she asked, but it wasn't surprise. It was an admission. This was just the beginning. Have you ever been in a situation where suspicions turned into reality? What would you have done in Hank's place? Hank stood there, holding the phone, breathing heavily as if every breath was a heavy stone weighing on his chest. He looked at Louise, her face no longer as carefree as before. She tried to smile, but it was empty, more like a forced grimace to hide her confusion. "You know everything," Louise said softly, looking up at Hank, her voice gentle but tinged with bitterness. "It wasn't what you think. I never meant to deceive you. It just happened. I can't go back to what we had." Hank clenched his fist, unable to listen to her empty words anymore. His heart pounded so hard it felt like it was tearing apart. He looked at her sad face and felt the pain rise inside him. He couldn't keep standing in the shadow of her betrayal. This was a deep wound he couldn't just leave. "You think I don't see? You think I don't feel how you're changing?" Hank abruptly threw his phone on the table, but his gaze never left Louise. "I've figured it all out, Louise. You haven't been with me for a long time." Louise looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't take a single step toward him. She didn't apologize, didn't try to justify herself, and there was no regret in her gaze. Only disappointment in the fact that he had uncovered the truth. "You're right," she said, her voice dull, almost emotionless. "I've changed. I didn't want it, but it happened. And I can't turn it back now." Hank turned away, unable to look at her face, which seemed so foreign to him, even though he saw it every day. He never imagined it would hurt so much. He hadn't anticipated that it wouldn't just be betrayal, but also a deep injustice. But the worst was yet to come. After that evening, Hank couldn't find peace. Thoughts about how Louise had behaved with that man, Thomas, tortured him. Who was he? How long had they been seeing each other? How had Louise changed her life without caring about his feelings? Hank couldn't understand why she did it. Wasn't what he gave her enough? After all, he had always been there, supporting her, giving her everything he could. He decided he needed to know more. Hank wasn't used to just sitting and watching his life fall apart. If she had chosen another path, he had the right to know who she now wanted to be with. That same evening, when Louise went to take a shower, Hank went to her work laptop left on the table. He sat down on the chair and tried to stay calm. Every movement was driven by one goal, to learn more. He didn't know exactly what he was looking for, but he felt that this step would be important. While going through her emails, Hank came across a message that caught his attention. It was from the same Thomas. Going beyond ordinary work correspondence, he saw words that were clearly more personal. "I can't wait for you to come. I've been waiting for this moment for so long. You mean everything to me, Louise." It was the phrase that changed everything. And there he was, standing on the brink of despair, but his determination was unshakable. He searched for the name of this man and found out that Thomas was her ex-boyfriend. The same guy she had broken up with back in college. Hank couldn't believe it. Louise had gone back to him. But he knew he had to act. That same evening, Hank went to the restaurant where Louise worked. He knew that at the end of her workday, she usually stayed to have drinks with her friends. Hank decided to see it with his own eyes. Entering the restaurant, he felt his heart race. He saw her among the other employees. She was the center of attention, laughing, flirting. And again, she was the way he hadn't remembered her for a while. His heart pounded. But suddenly, his gaze stopped on a table in the corner. There sat the same Thomas, laughing with her. Hank felt as though his whole world had fallen apart. But this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of his revenge. Hank was breathing heavily, watching Louise and her ex-boyfriend Thomas. The whole restaurant seemed to have turned into a foreign and hostile place for him. The whole situation reminded him of a trap from which he couldn't escape. His eyes couldn't look away from how Louise was laughing, how her hand touched Thomas's shoulder. His heart felt an emptiness that deepened with every passing moment. He could no longer allow himself to be weak. If Louise wanted this man, he had to make her understand that he also had the right to his emotions, to his justice. He went up to the bar, ordered a glass of whiskey, and began to think. It was clear that he couldn't just walk up to Thomas and kick him out of there. That would only confirm his weakness. He decided to act more cleverly. A few minutes later, Hank stood up and headed for the exit. He didn't go home. Instead, he walked down the street, deciding what to do next. His heart was racing with tension, and his thoughts were filled with a desire for revenge. This was no longer just an ordinary grievance. It was a challenge that Louise had no right to ignore. The night was difficult, but Hank had decided. He would return, but he would not be the same as before. He wouldn't tolerate her lies. Over the next few days, Hank carefully planned how to make Louise pay for everything. And every action of his led to one result. She would have to understand that he wasn't someone to be deceived. He wouldn't sit quietly in the corner while his life was destroyed. Louise and Thomas continued to meet, but Hank started getting more information about their relationship. He found ways to learn about their meeting places, their plans. He acted calmly, as if nothing had happened, but inside him, a storm was raging. One time, when Louise was going to meet Thomas again, Hank decided to make his next move. He prepared everything in a way that would expose her once and for all. He did something that was meant to settle everything for good. During their meeting, when Louise was going to have another romantic dinner with Thomas, Hank came to the same restaurant, but this time not to sit quietly and watch. His plan was already set. He was meant to look not like the usual man who suffers from betrayal. No, he was a man who controlled the situation. As soon as Hank entered the restaurant, he saw Louise and Thomas at the same table. Their faces, their conversations, all reflected how close they had become. Louise was looking at Thomas with eyes Hank had never seen in her gaze before. It was the same feeling Hank had when he first met her, this intimacy, this warmth. And now, it was all there for another man. Hank raised his hand, greeting the bartender, and then walked over to the table where they were sitting. Louise saw him, and her eyes lit up with surprise and recognition. "Hank," she whispered, but Thomas interrupted her. "What are you doing here?" he asked sharply, but Hank wasn't scared. "What am I doing here?" Hank laughed and sat at the table next to theirs. "I'm here so you both understand. I'm not playing by your rules anymore." Thomas frowned, but Louise just sat silently, watching. Hank pulled out his phone and pressed a few buttons. "You thought I didn't know," he said, not looking at them. "I know everything. I've seen you together. I know what you've done, Louise. But there's one thing you don't know." And at that moment, Hank pressed a button, and a video appeared on the screen. Now, as everyone was looking at him, he realized he had full control of the situation. He felt strong and calm. Louise and Thomas went silent. Fear was in their eyes. And this was just the beginning. Hank watched as Louise and Thomas exchanged glances, trying to come up with an explanation for how all of this had happened. There was panic in their eyes. She realized that everything she had tried to hide was now out in the open. In her heart, there were still memories of her intimate moments with Hank, but the fear of the consequences started to outweigh them. Thomas was sitting across from her, not taking his eyes off Hank's phone screen, and he suspected that this man hadn't come here for nothing. Hank could feel the tension in the air, his mind boiling with the desire to watch Louise pay for her hypocrisy. "Hank." Louise tried to say something, but her voice cracked. Hank remained calm, but deep inside, he felt his emotions boiling over. He realized that this wasn't the end of his plan. In fact, this was just the first step toward real revenge. "You thought I wouldn't find out," he said, looking at her with cold detachment. "You thought you could just cheat on your husband like that." Louise seemed to try to defend herself, but all her words were so weak that Hank couldn't bear to listen to them. He didn't want to waste any more time on empty talk. Thomas, who had been silent this whole time, suddenly leaned toward Louise and whispered something in her ear. Hank could feel the anger rising within him. This was yet another confirmation that they had no moral barriers. Instead of giving them time, Hank stood up, deciding that he needed more than just these photos and videos. He pulled their shadows along with him to finish what he had started. And while they sat there, flustered, Hank made another move that seemed too risky for him. A few days later, Hank received unexpected news. His former friend, James, called him and said he had seen Louise in town with someone else. This man was another of her old acquaintances, Richard, who Hank had once known well. However, Hank barely recognized him now. Richard was already very rich. His life was completely different from what it had been before. And perhaps, with this change, he became the perfect candidate for Louise's new adventure. Hank couldn't believe his ears. He realized that he was just a part of her game. But why so deeply? And why did he still feel like he wanted to do something more? He couldn't remain passive anymore. This had become not just his wife's betrayal, it was a challenge that he needed to answer. The next day, Hank followed Louise after hearing from James where she might be. He couldn't believe his eyes when he saw her enter an expensive hotel where Richard was waiting for her. Hank decided to leave her a gift. Instead of directly confronting them, he decided to prepare yet another proof of her infidelity. He found the hotel's phone number, and using his connections in the police, ordered photos and videos from the surveillance cameras. He couldn't just watch. If Louise wanted to do this to him, he had to give her the same in return. That evening, Hank returned home. He sat in silence, going through the proof of the betrayal, feeling his heart beat faster with each new picture and video. His emotions were boiling, but there was still calmness. In his mind, a decision was taking shape about what he should do. The evening of Louise's meeting with Richard at the hotel turned out to be the last. Hank called her late at night when she probably thought everything had passed. "You think I don't know?" His voice sounded low and firm. Louise froze. She knew her time had come. "How did you find out?" Her voice was full of panic. "I saw you with him. And this is just the beginning. You should have known that betrayal isn't a game for me." Her responses were vague. She tried to explain something, but every word of hers sounded weaker. "You and Thomas, and now Richard. You looked like you were missing something in our life, Louise. But I found your weaknesses, and now you will live with the consequences." At that moment, Hank took the final step, preparing for revenge. Louise sat in the darkness of her bedroom when her phone buzzed again. Every time it rang, her heart froze in fear. She knew that Hank wasn't just disappointed. He was furious and ready for anything. She couldn't believe how things had gotten to this point. Just a few weeks ago, her life seemed perfect. A few months ago, Hank seemed like the perfect husband. Caring, loving, faithful. But her heart, it seemed, couldn't stay true to him. She was in search of new sensations, new emotions, and couldn't stop. When Hank called and told her he knew about her betrayals, she started to deny it. At first, she even thought she could play it off and things would go back to how they were. But with each new piece of evidence, she realized she couldn't escape this. This isn't over, she thought as she listened to his words. She didn't know whether she should say anything more or just pray he wouldn't seek even greater revenge. Her mind was full of thoughts, but one stood out. I can't stay with Hank anymore. I have to find another way. The next day, Hank took the first step. He went to a lawyer and started working on a revenge plan. He didn't just want to free himself from Louise. He wanted to take everything from her. Those months when he lived in an illusion of happiness now only became painful memories. But at some point, he realized something was wrong. The lawyer he had consulted seemed like an ordinary person at first glance, but there was something in his gaze, in that special confidence he carried, that aroused Hank's suspicions. All of the lawyer's questions seemed too personal. They didn't just touch on the divorce but also on Hank himself, his feelings, and his experiences. I know you want revenge, the lawyer said when Hank finally decided to speak. But you have to understand that revenge can be costly. There are limits to everything. You don't want this to backfire on you. These words struck Hank. He realized that the lawyer was speaking about more than just legal matters. Maybe someone else had experienced something like this. Hank didn't believe in coincidences, so he felt that there was something he hadn't noticed yet. When he asked the lawyer about this, he replied, "Revenge isn't always the best path. But sometimes, the one who least expects it is the one who walks this path." These words sounded like a riddle. Hank couldn't figure out what was being said. But the next day, he received unexpected news that made him question who his true enemy was. When Hank came home, he saw that the door was slightly ajar. His heart went into a frantic rhythm, as he hadn't expected anyone home, especially after agreeing with Louise to leave her in peace for a while. He entered and froze when he saw that in the room was not only Louise, but also the lawyer, the same one he had met a few days ago. "What are you doing here?" Hank swallowed the bitterness in his throat, realizing that something big and dark was happening. Louise flinched but didn't answer. The lawyer raised his head and looked at Hank with a calm gaze. "I'll say it again. You need to understand that revenge is not what you want," the lawyer said. "Your wife, Hank, is not who you thought she was. And this is only the beginning." These words made no sense to Hank until the lawyer added, "And do you know why I'm here? Because I'm actually working for someone else. You're not the only one caught up in intrigues here. Louise is not just betraying you. She's dealing with someone far above both of you." Hank felt his heart freeze in his chest. He looked at Louise, and suddenly all those moments when he had doubted her started to resurface. You were in cahoots with him?" Hank looked at the lawyer, feeling how this treacherous step was changing his world. The lawyer just smiled, and Louise, finally lifting her eyes, quietly said, "It wasn't just your betrayal, Hank. It was a betrayal that changed our lives forever." Now Hank understood that what stood before him was not just his wife's betrayal. It was a much more complex and tangled plan that cast a new light on everything that had happened. "You don't understand," the lawyer continued. "You're still in the game, but the rules have changed." Hank stood before them, with a sense that he had been nothing but a pawn in someone else's game, and now he had no choice but to go into full battle, one that would change everything. Hank couldn't believe his ears. He stood before Louise and her mysterious ally, who turned out not to be just a lawyer, but part of some larger and very dangerous game that he hadn't even suspected. Louise was right there, but her eyes no longer held that innocent look Hank was so familiar with. He saw her in the eyes of another man, one who possessed power and influence. Someone who manipulated not just her feelings, but her life as well. "What do you want to say, Louise?" Hank said those words as if striking a knife against stone. "You've been playing me all along, haven't you? From the very beginning. And now you want to make it worse?" Louise sat on the edge of the bed, silently looking at Hank. There was no shame in her gaze, only the feeling that she held some secret from him, one he still hadn't figured out. The lawyer, as if understanding that Hank needed explanations, sat closer to him. "You think this is just infidelity?" His voice was calm, almost relaxed, which only intensified Hank's anxiety. "But it's not just about that. You never understood that you're standing in the way of people who are playing much bigger games." "I don't understand what you're talking about." Hank felt anger and despair mixing in his heart, but he didn't let his emotions take over. "This is just another manipulation, right?" The lawyer smiled and nodded slightly, as if he found it interesting to watch Hank struggle with these secrets. I'll tell you more. You'll learn the truth, Hank, but it's not just about you and Louise. This is a global game, and you're just a beginner in all of this. Louise lifted her head, and there was something new on her face, not pain, not sadness, not even anger. It was the face of someone who had long accepted their role in this story. I met him many months ago. At first, it was just for fun. Then, everything changed. I had a choice. Either stay with you and continue living in a lie, or become part of something bigger. She paused and looked at Hank as she said this. I chose this. Hank stood there, realizing that there was no turning back. He felt his heart tighten with disappointment. Louise was never the person he had known. She had changed, and not just because of the betrayal. She was part of a bigger plan, and he couldn't understand why he was only learning this now. You're part of someone's plan? What do you mean? Hank moved closer to her, as if trying to decipher her motives. The lawyer leaned back, hiding a smile. He knew that Hank was close to understanding, but not quite there yet. This is not just about your wife. This is what brought you here, Hank. You're here because your loyalty has become a problem for those who run this world. Maybe someone even kept you in the dark on purpose. Hank felt as though the ground was being pulled from under him. He could feel everything he thought he knew about his life begin to fall apart. Yes, I was just a pawn in this game, Hank said, lowering his head. And now I feel like my world is turning upside down. But who are you really? And what do you and Louise want from me? Louise raised her hands, responding calmly once more. You were just a part of the plan, Hank. And now, when everything is over, you'll decide whether you want to be part of this world. But don't worry, you'll have a choice. You can be with us. You can go your own way. It's up to you. The lawyer also joined in. Don't forget about us, Hank. We don't want to break you completely. But we want you to understand that you're not just some random occurrence here. You're an important piece in this big game. Hank didn't sleep all night. It was hard for him to understand what had just happened. The idea that he had become part of some large conspiracy only confused him more. He could no longer trust anyone, not even his own feelings. Every step Louise took, every glance from the lawyer, seemed to be part of something bigger. In the morning, he went to an old friend who had more information about the situation. He had another plan, a plan that could change his life forever. Hank knew he couldn't leave things as they were. He had to act. He had one thing left to do. Play his own game and figure out if he could escape this trap without losing himself completely. Hank didn't know if it was the right decision to go to his friend, but he couldn't leave the matter as it was. At night, when his thoughts chased him, he realized that one thing he couldn't change was his feelings for Louise. He still loved her. And although that feeling had been betrayed, thrown into the fire of manipulation and lies, it couldn't just disappear. But should he fight for her, when everything she had done showed no sign of any moral integrity left in her? The next day, Hank met with his friend, James. James was a former colleague of Hank's who now worked in the legal business and had significant influence in several high circles. He often dealt with tough issues, which was why Hank turned to him. Maybe he could help him sort things out. You won't believe what I've found out. Hank sat down on a chair and looked at James, who was sitting in his office with a thoughtful expression on his face. Tell me what happened. James gave him an intrigued look, trying to understand what had caused such a rift in Hank. Hank sighed heavily because he didn't know how to explain what was going on. It all seemed like part of some tangled game. I found out that Louise has other plans. And what she's done, it's all connected to some very large and serious organization. She's just one piece in this game. And I've become part of it, although I don't know if I want to be involved. James thought for a moment, twirling a pen in his hands, and then focused on Hank. You mean she's manipulating you? Or do you think she's been betrayed for some bigger goal? Hank nodded. Yes, I see how everything is developing. And now she's even working with the lawyer to convince me to leave all this behind. She wants me to accept it. And I almost broke. But something inside me tells me that I need to do more. I want to understand why this happened. James paused, thinking. He really understood how complicated Hank's situation was, but his intuition told him that there was something more hidden in this story. You know, Hank, I think you won't be able to just walk away without knowing all the details. You need to find out more about who Louise is really dealing with. I've already heard rumors that her lawyer is just one of many who work for those behind her. You need to realize that she has a lot more enemies than you think. And these people, they won't stop, even when you're on the edge. Hank sighed deeply, trying to make sense of everything he had just heard. He was hurt, But he understood that if he didn't uncover this game, even if he left Louise, his life would never be at peace. What should I do? Hank felt like his life was no longer in his control. I'll tell you how to get more information. You need to find those who are working with Louise's lawyer. And I'll help you do that, James said, glancing at his notes, which reminded him of a certain person Hank needed to meet. Meanwhile, Louise felt on top of the world. Her plan was in full swing, and she could almost feel everything starting to pay off. But deep down, she still felt a sense of sadness. She truly loved Hank, but that was in the past. Now, she had become part of a larger scheme that she couldn't just walk away from. She had to act. However, her feelings toward Hank began to change. She started doubting whether she was doing the right thing. All these manipulations, all these people who weren't worth it, the ones she had gotten involved with. But she was already in the game. All that was left was to make her decision when everything came to light. Since then, Hank and Louise had been fighting parallel battles for their place in this world. He was searching for the truth, and she was fighting to maintain control over the situation. Hank stood at the door of the same hotel where Louise had met with her lawyer. He had managed to get some information, and now he was ready to learn more than she had ever told him. But when he entered the room, what he saw exceeded all his expectations. Louise and the lawyer were sitting together. They weren't just business partners. They were together in every sense of the word. And Hank saw it. But before he could take the next step, he made an important decision. He decided not just to seek revenge, but to rebuild his life without them. However, he realized that in order to win his freedom, he needed to leave this world behind, leaving everything he knew and moving toward new possibilities. Hank stood at the threshold of the hotel room, his face grim, but his eyes burning with a desire to know the truth. He had already been to several meetings to reach this moment, but today, in this room, he felt that the answer was about to be revealed. Logic told him that Louise couldn't have deceived him so openly without noticing all the traps he had set. But this wasn't just an act of betrayal. It was a game that was pulling more and more people in. He reached for the door handle but suddenly froze. His phone began vibrating in his pocket. Instead of answering, he simply glanced at the screen. James. Hank, you need to be careful. A voice came quickly through the receiver. I've learned something more. Something beyond just the betrayal. Louise isn't just working with the lawyer. She's involved with businessmen, and one of them has been interested in her heart for a long time. You probably don't know, but this isn't just a romance, it's a strategic partnership. She's working on a huge deal that could change everything. Hank froze. What James had said felt like a hammer blow to the head. Everything he had thought about Louise and her betrayal suddenly took on a new meaning. He wasn't just one of her manipulation targets. He might have been part of a bigger game, and his role could be much smaller than he had thought. He quickly ended the call and walked further into the room. Something wasn't sitting right with him, but the feeling that this was the moment of truth urged him to act. Step by step, he moved toward the door. Every sound, every noise, felt like a warning, but he could no longer stop. And suddenly, he opened the door. Inside, on the couch, sat Louise, and next to her was a man, tall, of above-average height, with dark hair and a stern face. This was the same businessman James had mentioned. But what Hank hadn't expected was the obvious chemistry between them. They weren't just business partners. They looked like they shared much more than just business. Hank, Louise lifted her gaze to him, her voice as cold as he was. What? Still don't understand? Hank was stunned. Just moments ago, everything had seemed clear, and now he stood before a massive web of confusion, with Louise, his wife, at the center. You're not just deceiving me, he whispered, staring at her face. You're playing a much bigger game. Was I part of your plans from the very beginning? Louise remained silent for a few moments, as if choosing her words carefully. It was more than just betrayal, Hank, she said, rising from the couch. Her voice softened, but remained cold. It was a strategy. You weren't the only one who lost their place. I lost mine too. But now I understand that everything I've been striving for was power, influence, and opportunities. And you weren't needed for that. Hank felt his heart tighten with pain. Everything he had believed in, everything he had tried to build with her, was falling apart right before his eyes. But before he could say anything, his gaze briefly landed on the other man in the room. He looked into his eyes and suddenly understood that this wasn't just her business partner. This was her lover, and he wasn't the only one. How could you? Hank blurted out, though he didn't even fully understand what bothered him more. Whether it was that Louise had betrayed him, or that this was only one of many betrayals she had hidden from him. "This isn't what you think, Hank," the businessman said quietly, standing up and moving toward him. "Louise made her choice, and now we're both in a different world." Hank didn't answer, his mind working at full capacity, trying to make sense of everything that was happening. "I'm sorry, but you're not part of this," the businessman added, stepping back as Hank moved as if ready to strike. But what happened next changed the course of this story. Unexpectedly for everyone, a different kind of relationship began between Louise and the businessman. It was no longer just a deal, it was a game they played together. And Hank had become nothing more than a pawn on the chessboard they had built. He left the room, leaving behind all his uncertainty and pain. He wasn't ready to leave his wife, but he certainly wasn't ready to surrender to this game. Now, he had a choice, to learn more, or to stop everything he had left. But one thing was clear, he was no longer the favorite on the field where Louise played her games. This inning was just the beginning of a new game, and all Hank had left to do was decide how he would play it next. Louise looked at Hank with a cold expression, as if all the years of their shared life were just a game. She felt no remorse for her betrayal, neither towards him nor his feelings. In her eyes, only self-interest and the pursuit of a new goal reflected. Hank, staring at her, felt his heart slowly dying. He couldn't believe he had become part of this cruel game, where he was just a pawn. The tension in the room was palpable. Hank seemed to be losing control. His hands were trembling with anger and frustration. This was not just betrayal, it was manipulation, using him as a stepping stone towards a goal he didn't even understand. "Have you always been like this, Louise?" he asked with cold fury, trying to suppress his emotions. Louise simply smiled in response, her gaze distant and unreachable, like someone who had long since stopped feeling anything for their partner. "You knew, Hank." Her voice softened, but this only made it sound more detached. "I've always been interested in other possibilities, not just family life. You were just a stepping stone for me. And now, you're no longer needed." Hank stood silently, looking at her. He couldn't believe this woman, with whom he had spent so many years, was capable of manipulating him so cruelly. And more than that, he now understood that all this time, he had been deceived. Louise was far from the person he had loved. He glanced at the man sitting next to her. It was the same businessman she had spent time with when he was at work. And in his eyes, Hank saw only cold indifference. "Sorry, but you don't understand anything, Hank," the businessman said, standing up. "Louise made her choice a long time ago. You just won't be able to comprehend everything that's behind this. This is more than just betrayal. This is about big money, opportunities, influence. And you no longer have a place in our game." Hank felt something inside him snap. His whole life, all his struggles for his family, for the future, for Louise, suddenly seemed meaningless. All his attempts to hold it all together crashed down on him like ruins. "You don't even realize what you've led us to," the businessman added, stepping closer to Hank. "But don't worry. Maybe you'll understand when this is all over." Hank felt his anger boil inside his chest. His mind refused to accept all of this, but his instincts wouldn't let him stop. He realized that he was now facing a choice. Either he would lose everything and remain just part of their plan, or he would do something that would change everything once and for all. The idea of revenge, which he could never have imagined before, slowly began to fill his thoughts. This was no ordinary betrayal. This was a deadly game he had been dragged into. Hank slowly turned toward the door. "I'm leaving all of this, Louise. And so are you." His words were cold, resolute. "I won't be part of your games anymore. I'll find my own way." He left the room, leaving behind two people who continued to weave their plans. He could hear Louise desperately shouting after him, but it didn't matter. He was no longer part of her world. And that was the first thing that truly gave him a sense of freedom. Hank didn't know what he would do next, but he was sure that his place there was over. He understood that now it wasn't just about revenge, but about his own survival in this cruel world, where he had never been needed, only used. A few days later, Hank received a call from James. It didn't matter anymore, but he picked up the phone, gathering his thoughts into a single knot. "How are you?" James asked, not waiting for an answer. "I know it was hard, but I have something for you. Something that will change everything." "I'm listening," Hank said, gritting his teeth. "Louise isn't just manipulating you. She's now teaming up with several other people. I found out that her business partner has big plans. And you know what? They're preparing for a major deal. And this deal involves you." "What do you mean?" "She used you to get access to you. You weren't just a husband. You were a tool to achieve her goals. But now that you're out of the game, Louise has started playing by different rules. Now Hank knew that this was just the beginning. The moment he lost, everything became his turning point. He was no longer a passive player in someone else's game. This was his game. And now he decided when and how to take the next step in his fight for his future. Hank couldn't sit calmly at home. He began organizing his plan for revenge, realizing that Louise and her new partners wouldn't leave him alone. Every step he took seemed right, but the internal pain from betrayal and manipulation remained sharp, like a knife's edge. His first step was to gather more information about Louise's business partner. James, his old acquaintance who worked in finance, told him something that surprised Hank. "Louise is not just cheating on you," James said over the phone. "She's planning a big financial move, and you probably have no idea what it's leading to." "What kind of move?" Hank asked, eager to learn more. "She's preparing a deal with her business partner that will allow her to take a significant portion of your assets. Not all of her dealings have been clean. This is more than just family drama. It's a fight for power and money." Hank felt his heart tighten. All these years he had worked hard to secure his family's future, and now he found out that Louise had been using him just as a means to achieve her goals. His property, his accomplishments, had become nothing more than tools for her. And now, learning that this was just part of her grand plan, he realized he had been nothing but a pawn in her game. Now Hank had two goals: to take revenge for the betrayal and to stop her from carrying out her plan. He couldn't let her take what he had built. And although he wasn't a financial expert, he decided to use what he knew, his connections and his instincts, and that would be enough to stop Louise. A few days later, Hank went to meet an old acquaintance. It was Colin, who had connections in legal circles and had helped Hank in difficult situations before. Colin knew how the world of big money worked, and now he would have to help Hank. "I understand why you're here," Colin said, removing his glasses and looking at Hank. "You want to deal with Louise and her partner, right?" "Exactly," Hank replied. "I have some suspicions, and I want you to help me find the evidence." Colin began checking his sources. He said he could get access to some documents, but it would take time. At that moment, Hank felt that every minute counted. "We need to act fast, Colin," Hank added. "Louise and her partner are already preparing for a big deal. She wants to take my assets. I can't let her do that." "I understand," Colin said. "But remember, you're not alone in this fight. I'll help, but we need to be careful." Meanwhile, Louise and her new partner were working on their plans. Hank found out that they were indeed preparing a deal that could put him in a very difficult position, taking all his financial assets. She was more determined than he had imagined. But Hank knew, in the fight for his dignity, he couldn't afford to lose. The next day, Hank received word from Colin. "I found something interesting," he said on the phone. "Louise and her partner are really planning to manipulate your assets. But there's one thing they miscalculated." Hank couldn't contain his curiosity. "What is it?" he asked. "They have one document that's forged. If you can prove it's a forgery, the deal will fall apart." Hank felt his heart skip a beat. This was the chance he had been waiting for. If he could prove that the document was fake, their entire operation would fail. "How can I get this document?" he asked. "I can help, but you have to be careful. It's a big risk." Hank was facing a tough choice. He could simply let Louise and her partner take what they wanted, but then he would lose. Instead, he decided to bet on his last chance. This was his game, and he had to win it. In the following days, Hank started taking action. He contacted people who could help him uncover more facts about Louise's deal. He put his heart on the line, knowing that if he was lucky, he could turn the situation to his advantage. And then, just when it seemed like he had lost all hope, Hank received the long-awaited documents from Colin. It was the very forgery that could destroy Louise's plan. Hank had the proof, and now all that was left was to take the final step, to destroy everything Louise had so carefully built and show her that he wouldn't let her manipulations ruin his life. Hank was getting closer to his revenge, and he was ready to rip everything out of his wife's hands. She didn't know she was already standing on the edge of the cliff. Hank could no longer bear it. He stood before a great opportunity that could not be missed. Weeks of tense work, deception, and cunning had finally paid off. The document confirming the forgery was in his hands. All that was left was to decide how best to use this trump card. At that moment, as he held the treacherous paper, Hank did not feel joy. Instead, he was overcome with emptiness. He knew that his revenge would be painful and leave Louise with nothing. But was he truly ready to turn her life into ruins? Perhaps he could still find another way? Meanwhile, Louise, becoming more and more immersed in her financial schemes, had no idea that her world would soon begin to fall apart. Hank noticed that her behavior had become even more brazen than before. He realized, not only had she betrayed him with her business partner, but she was also ready to take everything he had earned without the slightest doubt, and all of it with a hypocritical smile on her face. But when Hank came home that evening to finally decide what to do with the evidence he had obtained, he was met with a new shock. He saw a serious document on the table, a contract signed with his name. This was the very same deal Louise had planned to sign with her partner, but now everything looked as though Hank had made the decision himself. The document was signed. "What is this?" he whispered, picking up the paper. He rushed to the computer and began reviewing all the documents that Colin had recently sent him. His eyes stopped on one letter that seemed to be addressed to him, but turned out to be entirely fake. It was a fraud. All the signatures, even his own, had been forged. Hank's heart tightened. He couldn't even imagine that Louise could have planned such a devious move. Not only had she been manipulating his finances, but she had also made him sign an agreement he knew nothing about. And even when he tried to restore the truth, it turned out that he had already been lured into a game he didn't even understand. The choice was difficult. Hank couldn't allow Louise to win, but he also understood that fully destroying her would not give him peace. She had to answer for her actions, but not in this way. A new plan began to form in his mind, not to ruin her, but to make her realize her mistakes on her own. And maybe, at the end of this path, they could start over, if that was even possible. Now he knew that revenge had to be more than simple. It had to be clever, so that Louise would understand her mistake and eventually see the world without her selfish and manipulative views. Perhaps Hank could change everything, not through force, but through intellect. He picked up the document again. Now he had to decide, not to destroy it, but to act wisely. And although the past few months had been a true test for him, he felt that this was his moment. Do you think Hank can forgive Louise if he understands the full depth of her manipulations and betrayal?